Greetings, citizen. Welcome to the show, and thank you for listening. For more of the art of wargaming in your life, definitely check us out on Instagram and Facebook. If you'd like to support the show, we have a Patreon account where you can do just that for as little as $1 a month. What we can offer will expand as the show does. If you don't have extra funds but would still like to help us out, you can give us a like, share, or 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. Want to get in touch? Feel free to message us or hit up our email, artofwargamingpodcast@gmail.com. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you because we know the world is vast, with many different ideas on tactics and strategy that can be applied to the games we enjoy.
You're listening to the Art of Wargaming on the Earworm Network.
On War. Defensive Relations in Strategy.
Welcome to the Art of Wargaming on the Earworm Network. I am Yaga Malark. Today's episode concerns defensive relations in strategy. Well, before we get into that, I recently started messing around with this AI art generator, which, I mean, is nothing compared to what an actual artist can make. A physical artist or a digital artist. There's a lot of skill that goes into really perfecting that sort of art. But for a neophyte, for an absolute Luddite like myself, something like this is a way to see pretty things just on hand and to make cool designs. Now, I of course am all about making sure that it's declared to be AI art. I don't want to take away from actual artists' work, but it's still really cool. And I've started messing around with it and putting some of the creations on the Instagram and Facebook, which have notoriously been quiet. But this month I did get up the battles that kind of took place, some of the bigger historic battles that I could find that took place on those dates, hoping to do so for November and December and onwards as well, so we can kind of understand maybe what was happening in history, and if we're from those areas, look around at maybe the climate and everything that contributed to it, perhaps have some more realism to it, which is nice. So yeah, check out the Instagram and the Facebook and see some adequate AI art and some informational little memes that I enjoy putting out there, and I enjoy educating people, the whole point of the show. So check it out. Today's interviewee is somebody who I've only just met. For the majority of these interviews, I've been, of course, doing people that I know because that's the easiest thing to do when you are terrible at networking. But through Military Miniatures, I was able to make contact with somebody else. In fact, Mark Leproto, he's outstanding, and he kind of provided the networking to get Adam from TFG Radio on. And for those of you who don't play Warhammer 40K, Adam is... again, he's a co-host of TFG Radio, and TFG Radio is a fairly big podcast in the 40K community, analyzing kind of the tournament scene, general meta, and kind of going into running the leadership and nuances of being in charge of some of these events, including some of the biggest, like LVO. So I'm very much excited for you guys to be able to hear this interview. I very much enjoyed recording this interview. So yeah, check it out. He has a fantastic new game. The majority of what we are going to talk about is this really cool game about Meso-America. And to kind of preface it, of course, most of the books we've been doing, if you'll notice, have been from a European point of view. The reason for that is there's not a whole lot of surviving literature from other civilizations on this subject. I mean, obviously other civilizations had tactics and had ideas, but for the most part, a lot of that knowledge was lost during colonialism. So it's really cool for somebody who has to study a majority, like European history is kind of where my focus has to be, because that's where the breadth of the literature focuses on. But it's always nice to be able to talk with somebody who's had a different perspective, a different specialty in their study, and I get to learn something. So I'm looking forward to y'all learning something. I got to learn something, just smiles all around. And this whole thing, talking about Military Miniatures, Larcapoto, and Adam, this idea of networking, right? This is something that is good to do in any organization that we're a part of, anything that we want to actually become involved in. It's about meeting new people and exchanging ideas. It's very important. So it's military science in action, I guess, is kind of what I'm kind of driving at in a long stretch sort of way. But if you think about, again, military action, those who have the allies generally have the most support, obviously, and they're able to apply the most pressure, maybe dissuade opponents from coming at them, because you're not just fighting them, you're fighting everyone. And obviously, Adam and I aren't going to be going side to side in some sort of medieval fight, unless he wants to. We can figure that out. But more the idea of the more the merrier. I'm able to exchange ideas with Adam. I was able to exchange ideas with Jason at Military Miniatures. And the more the merrier. The more that I'm able to learn, the more that we're able to kind of let the information flow, and the more it benefits all of us, including y'all, because the more diverse perspective, the better. So I look forward to being able to share the results of all of my networking, and potentially another friend coming on from that direction, another friend of the show, who will be helping me discuss other matters such as the Ukraine war. So more on that in the future. But I think I have droned on long enough. Let's move on to the main course of this particular episode: defensive relations in strategy. When we're talking about Clausewitz, remember that strategy is more of an overarching plan than something very specific. For instance, tactics, anything to deal with tactics, which is most of the actual fighting, is a part of strategy, but strategy itself cannot actually gain a victory. Because victories are achieved tactically. A strategy is kind of the plan. Strategy is how we use these victories to achieve our ultimate aim. This is what Clausewitz is arguing. I'm not sure that I understand precisely the nuance of this, but I think what he's driving at is that without these successes, tactically, there is no strategy. So it relies on that. That's how we attain our victories, is through this. Again, we can have the best strategy in the world, but if it can't follow through tactically, we're not going to achieve anything. So when we're dealing with strategy, it doesn't apply specifically as much to something like Bellegarth or 40K, because what we're dealing with there more concerns tactics. In 40K, there's a bit more of strategy, because you do have these smaller fights that are taking place that then you can use to achieve other goals or objectives. And in larger battles, when we're dealing with physical wargaming, something like Bellegarth, in that case, there might be something to be said for strategy, maybe. But for the most part, strategy is, okay, I've won at this fight in this city. I'm now going to move my forces up this road to lay siege to this castle. And then, tactically speaking, that siege occurs. And then we move on strategically. So, that's his point. And the idea with strategy is to take the sum of all of these actions and use it in the most productive and efficient manner possible. Whether we're on the attacking side or the defending side, we're trying to do things, obviously, the best that we can. And strategy is how we accomplish that. So when we're dealing with strategy, the principles of it are very similar to what we deal with tactically. There are some other considerations, and some of the principles do change in the way that we interpret them. But when we're going down the list, we have advantage of ground, the surprise, attack from several quarters, assistance in the theater of war by fortresses, the support of the people, and the utilization of great moral forces. So right off the bat, we see some familiar faces here. Number one, advantage of ground. We could talk about that all day long. In fact, we've done episodes on it. We will do other episodes on it. This idea of using the ground to our advantage, whether we're just picking a good spot, changing it in some way, putting up earthworks, laying landmines, that advantage is huge. And again, that is almost always taken by the defense, is this advantage of ground. So we don't need to spend a whole lot of time on that concept. The second one, the surprise, can either be one of two things. It can either be an attack, in which case we move into, of course, the tactics, or it can be a display. A surprise can be a sudden appearance of troops where we didn't think that they were going to be. And that throws off our plan. That throws off what we're going to be able to accomplish tactically, or where we're going to want to go. There are many battles throughout history where it was just a simple interruption that maybe caused a redirect or a confrontation on somebody else's terms. But the surprise, this display, is a distraction most of the time as well. It's either the show of force to discourage coming at them, or being like, hey, look over here, while we're bringing up something around the side. The other thing that we can look at about surprise from the offensive point of view is the fact that the offense can surprise the defense by avoiding the battle entirely. If the defense is hunkered down and they're like, okay, this is where we're going to stand, and the enemy is going to come to us, and we've fortified our ground, we have a really good position, really well funded, resourced, our lines of battle is really secure, all this other stuff. The offense can look at that and say, nah, and just move on to going and doing something else and trying to attack in another way. Because there are always the surprise, right? There's a display. Another way that the offense can utilize the concept of surprise is by avoiding the battle entirely. Just because there's a defender in front of them and the battle seems to be inevitable doesn't mean that they have to commit forces. They can disengage and go somewhere else. And this may come as a surprise to the defender, who may think that where they are, or the way that they stand in, is going to be the most important, and something that the offense has to take in order to achieve other objectives. So, in this way, the offense absolutely has the advantage of surprise in strategy. The defense, not so much. The defense has to play to what the offense is doing. In tactics, it can kind of go both ways. But when we're dealing with strategy, the surprise is entirely, usually anyways, on the side of the offense, even in something as simple as this. When we're dealing with the idea of attack from several quarters, what we're thinking about is within several theaters of the overall war. In tactics, of course, we're speaking about how to maneuver against our enemy who is directly in front of us in ways that we can get like an encirclement, or penetrate defenses where they are weak. Whatever we can take from this, that attack from several quarters is specific, like to that one enemy. But in a theater of war, there is no way to bring an enemy under two fires. They're either on fire or being fired upon, or they aren't. Tactically speaking, they may be surrounded, or there may be armies coming around from around them, but it's not the same when we're dealing with strategy. Because oftentimes this multiple fires bringing in, attacking, there are no rear and there is no flanks. This idea of a line of retreat isn't as important as it is in tactics. I mean, it still is important. If you cut somebody off from a supply depot or a capital, that can lead to either a political or material advantage. But it's not as important. It's not going to break the game if you interrupt it, because there are ways in strategy for us to rectify that situation. It is not a almost immediate disqualifier for victory. So the advantage here, of course, is made when we attack on several fronts, or when we cause our opponent to be attacked on several fronts. Think of Nazi Germany in the Second World War, when they were opening up that second theater toward Russia while still engaged with people in the West. This was a mistake, obviously, because it put man and material in two different directions where they could have focused in one or the other. This had to happen during the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolutionary Wars too, because the France was on constant siege from all sides. It wasn't like they had a whole lot of friends. They're on the continent. They were surrounded by enemies. So by opening up these other fronts, by opening up other places where they're being attacked, this massively affects strategy. And again, this is something that is in the offense's wheelhouse. They have the advantage on this one. They're the ones in motion, trying to achieve something over there. Now, as much as it spreads out our opponent's forces, it also spreads out our own, because instead of attacking en masse in one particular spot, we are also spreading out our attack, which is to say we are blunting our edge somewhat. Now, if this is a display, or if this is an attack elsewhere to open something up, then that's outstanding. But it doesn't change the fact that the display aspect still costs us men, or soldiers, in that theater of war. It's not for free. Those are soldiers that could be a part of the main advance or could be attacking, period, if we're dealing with displays. So this is to be considered, because numbers, as Clausewitz says, are important. It's one of the most important things in war. So taking away from our attack to do this, it better be a darn good plan. We better have a darn good strategy for reducing our numbers tactically in order to do something else. Because the rules are slightly different in strategy than in tactics, when we're dealing with this idea of attacks on the rear and the flanks, we also want basically the opposite of what we want in tactics. Because in tactics, the wider we can spread our wings and the more envelopment we can get on our opponent's flanks while still maintaining the integrity of our center, that's better, because that puts us in a position of advantage. In terms of defense, in a strategic situation, we have the advantage of interior lines. And interior lines, much like were used by Frederick the Great during his wars in Prussia, you're able to block from several different directions, and your opponent has to over-advance. That's just kind of the advantage that is always incurred in this situation, is that your opponent has to come forward, has to leave their position of power, their position of strategic defense over there, where their material is at, where their depots, where their towns are, and move into somebody else's territory. And so already the advantage is inferred or taken by the defense, because they are closer to their supplies. They are closer to everything that they're going to need. And so if we're using this to our advantage, if we're making sure to play the interior lines, make our opponents come to us, beat them, hopefully. I mean, that's the point of the whole strategy, right? Is to beat them tactically and then move on to something else. Well, in this particular case, that's good. Because if we can concentrate, we're able to redeploy faster. If we have an overall force and a quarter of our opponent's force comes towards us, we're able to assemble far more in that place while risking far less elsewhere, because our opponent has to spread out in order to attack us. And so if we're punching inwards, kind of like if you're doing martial arts, for instance, if we're fighting with our fists and our kicks, most of the time we're going for the inside, because from there we can block punches, from there we can deliver punches to our opponent's soft regions, their face, their gut, their torso and whatnot. And the same is true in strategy, where we want those interior lines because they make our job so much easier in terms of being able to defend from several different directions. And anytime we're dealing with this, we need to remember that any sort of attack is not made without a plan, and usually not made without the belief of victory, which is from assumed superiority. The Russians would not have invaded the Ukraine if they didn't think they were going to win. That would have been stupid. America did not invade Afghanistan not thinking that they were going to win. Vietnam, for that matter, or any of the other wars that have been entered throughout the years and have gone sourly for the person who initiated them. They obviously had a plan. Horace had a plan when he was sieging Tara. Otherwise, he would not have done it. Offensive actions are able to capitalize on this because they do automatically have the initiative. They're the ones that are moving in. We already kind of talked about this. So sometimes that is the defensive. It's on the defense where we're dealing with tactics, but always in strategy are we going to have the initiative going toward whoever is attacking. Even if the person who has been running an overall defensive campaign is the one attacking, they have then just switched on to the offense, right? They're moving into that other position. So that is the big difference here as well. And as we were saying, these roles can reverse. If the defender sees a weakness in the opposing line or in the opposing force, they can absolutely turn it about and become the attacker in that particular theater or in that particular, area of the war. So like we said, this particular principle is different than it is in tactics, but we're still playing by kind of the same rules, right? Trying to bring the most numbers to bear in the spot that we can to make the most effect tactically against our enemy. The next principle that we want to discuss, number 4, which is assistance in the theater of war by fortresses. Now, oftentimes this doesn't necessarily happen in the wargaming that we are doing, unless we're doing something that is more RP based, where it's like, okay, well, I'm going to occupy the fort and then you guys are going to come at me. We don't have this large, interconnected, nationwide series of forts, series of caches that we are able to draw upon. It's just not the same. We are very much unable to do that on the scale in which we do our wargaming. But for the sake of when we're talking about history, this is, again, naturally on the side of the defense, because the offense has to take those things. They have to take the forts, they have to take the supply caches and the munitions depots. They're having to move away from their own lines of logistics, stretching those lines out, which makes things far more complicated than they would be when running a campaign in your own territory. And so the logistics become a concern. They become weaker as well, weaker to attacks from the sides or attacks from the rear that cause those logistics to break up. So the offense definitely puts themselves on weaker footing when they are coming into opposing territory. The next concept was support of the people. And this is not necessarily guaranteed. Now, it's going to usually happen on the defensive side, but not always. Sometimes the defensive side either just cannot summon the morale because of apathy or because of outright rebellion. When we're dealing with a war in like an occupied area and people are coming into that place who are from that area, attacking fortifications perhaps from the occupiers, the local population might not support the occupiers. They might be in support of the folks who are coming back, potentially in their eyes, to liberate them. So while it is important to garner this, it is not always guaranteed for the defense, even in their own territory. Again, sometimes the defense may be supportive of the invasion. Perhaps the invaders are preferable to whatever regime they are currently living under. But usually if somebody is going to have this advantage, it is going to be the defense. But they need to find a way to garner it and to keep it, because it is really easy for war support to go south real fast. When America, for instance, first entered the war in Vietnam, there was a lot of public support for it. But very quickly after that, the public support began to dwindle and dwindle and dwindle to the point in which the public was actively hostile towards the soldiers that were coming back. Soldiers, in many cases, who had been drafted and maybe did not want to be there fighting that particular war against those particular people. So even in that case, when we're dealing with like the support of the people back home, that can turn very quickly too. So support is not guaranteed for the defense, and it is not guaranteed for the offense. So it needs to be seen to with great concentration. Lastly, when we're dealing with these fourth and fifth principles, namely assistance and support, Clausewitz adds kind of the point that I was making earlier, which is it matters where we are making our defense. It matters whether or not we are the original defense or the defense on our own soil. It matters whether or not we're the invaders and trying to do defense on their soil. And obviously, our position is going to be weaker if we are already in enemy or occupied territory. Again, the challenges that the United States military faced in Vietnam and in Afghanistan point to this entirely. A lot of times the local population isn't going to be cooperative because either they don't support the occupiers or because they're afraid of insurgents from the defensive side. Either way, you're dealing with a population that is not going to be nearly as forthcoming with aid or with information as a native population who may have the loyalty of that particular effort. Though again, as we've seen before in history, is not guaranteed. Some wars have been massively unpopular with the people who were fighting in them or the people who were funding them back home. And this is something that all generals, all politicians have to acknowledge and kind of work around. Because at the end of the day, the support for the war comes from, in democracies, the will of the people and the consent of the people. But even in other efforts, it takes a massive toll. Wars cost money, a lot of money, either from our own pockets or from other pockets. But weapons and training, these are expensive things. So every commander of every stripe and every president and every dictator and every king and every queen has always wanted to win a war quickly, to minimize not only on the financial instability and strain that it can bring to a treasury, but also the fact that these two principles are in play. And if they change, if they turn on the person who is trying to prosecute this conflict, they can't do much. At that point, it really suspends the war effort and hampers its ability to move forward. So these two are important very much for strategy. And these are also principles, before we move on, these are also principles that not only favor one side, but they actively disfavor the other. So, I mean, for instance, sometimes we have something in terms of a battlefield setup where the defense has good position and the offense has to come in and fight them. Well, the defense has a good position, but that good position does not take away from the capabilities of the offense. It may block some of their stuff, but they're still able to do what they need to do. In this particular case, when we're dealing with these two principles, it actively takes away from our opponent's ability to prosecute the battle. Because the more of these two principles, the more the assistance and support, the assistance of the fortresses and the supplies of the area, and the support of the people in the area, the more that these are in our favor, the more that it actively detracts from our opponent. Because not only will people, for instance, not cooperate with the occupying power, they might actively cooperate with the defensive power. In terms of munition acquisition or in terms of information exchange, this can absolutely go in the favor of one than the other and becomes an active detriment to the one who is not in charge or not receiving these two ideas. So again, this one is not as important for the wargaming aspect. We're not going to have to deal with these principles directly. Again, I can make some sort of stretch to kind of make them apply, but at the end of the day, this is overarching strategy. This is state policy that we're dealing with here, and state politics that feed into it. So again, these two are really important, strategically speaking, and I thought it was worth going over, even though it has nothing to do with what we do. I thought it might be interesting, for sure. The number 6, we were dealing with the great moral forces, and if you remember, we have talked about this quite a bit, because of its importance, not only in war, but also in wargaming. The great moral forces determine a whole lot of what is going to happen on the field or what is going to happen on the board. Because the great moral forces saturate every level of war and of wargaming. The great moral forces impact the kind of troops that we can bring to the battle, the esprit de corps that those troops are going to have, which influences how quickly they will take positions and how staunchly they will fight in the face of danger, in the face of the enemy. The great moral forces come into play when we're dealing with supply from back home, when we're dealing with, again, the support and the assistance of the people back home and in the area. The great moral forces dictate a lot of how those are going to support us and how effective that is going to be. These things are so important to everything we're doing, and that's why it's important to kind of maintain a positive attitude and engage positively with our community, because that can only benefit us in the games that we play, because we're bolstering our moral forces. We're not going out on tilt. We're able to focus on what we're able to bring to the table, and we're able to do it well, which is the whole point. Because, especially if we're the defender, we need to make sure that we have our poop in a group. That if we're the defender, we need to be even more disciplined and even more put together, not just in our forces, but in of ourselves, because the great moral forces favor the attack. It favors the one who are marching off. Now, in terms of wars that we're having in these days, it depends. It depends. From what I've seen in the war in the Ukraine, the Russians aren't exactly super behind what is going on there. Meanwhile, the vast majority of the Ukrainians are very much in support of the defensive efforts that are going on there. So the great moral forces can occupy that way as well. But in terms of actual active strategy, it favors the attack because the attack has the plan. The attack knows where they're going to go because they're the ones who have put that plan into action. And so from the get-go, the attack will throw the defender into some form of confusion and disorder. Even if it's reacted well to on the strategic level, there will be things coming into play that the defense does not anticipate. Ideally. Sometimes if you're going against somebody who's very predictable or very new to something, then yes, it might be painfully obvious what is going to happen, and we won't deal with the same level of confusion or disorder. Sometimes. Any fighter who's listening right now knows that noob foo is absolutely a thing. Maybe less so in things like war gaming, like tabletop war gaming, where a whole lot of concentration and knowledge of your rules and how they interplay is necessary. But in terms of chess and in terms of actual fighting, noob foo is a thing because people don't know the rules, which is to say they don't know how everybody else throws the shot. I have thrown the shots, the same 12 shots that I throw for 20 years because those are the forms that I've been practicing. Those are the ways that I have taught my body how to move. And so when I throw shots, they're coming from that practice. They're coming from those places. And so when I see them coming at me, I also know what to do because I have also shadowboxed against these ideas as well. So in either of these ways, when I'm fighting somebody who has been trained conventionally and who now fights conventionally in any sort of fashion, I have an advantage, as do they. But if somebody comes on the field and they don't know what they're doing and they're bringing some new flavor to us, that is absolutely a level of confusion that will upset our great moral forces. Nothing staggers a noob more, or staggers a veteran more, than when a noob does very well against them. Talk about confusion and disorder. Like that new fella that I was mentioning an episode or two ago here in Stygia, who has the blocks of an angel. Just insane, his level of blocking ability. And that threw me into confusion and disorder because I was not accustomed to being blocked that efficiently by somebody who was new. So the great moral forces were then on his side. And he won that match, by the way. He won it because I was thrown into confusion. And I was the attacker. So again, it really matters. It really matters, not just on the field, but also in a greater wargaming sense. And so again, we're going to keep stressing this particular thing because it is good. It is good to keep in a good mood and good to keep in good health if we're going to be the most efficient that we can be on the field. So these concepts, looking over the way that the defense has its relation to strategy against the offense, I think that I agree with Clausewitz, and I think you would too, that the defense is stronger of the two. If we're in the war, the defense is stronger. There are advantages that the attack absolutely has. There are advantages that our invading or attacking force definitely retains, but overall, when we're dealing with what contributes actually to the war effort and what contributes actively to victory, the defense is stronger, without a doubt, in my opinion. Well, now we're going to move on, and we are going to talk with Adam of TFG Radio about these ideas and about his new miniature game he's coming out with about war in Meso-America. Today to talk with us about wargaming, defense in strategy, and an outstanding new game in Meso-American warfare is Adam of TFG Radio. Adam, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, for those who may not know you, would you mind giving folks a little bit of a snapshot of your pedigree experience of wargaming?
Sure. I started when I was, my interest in miniature wargaming started when I was about 10, 11 years old. One of my uncles had, I'm pretty sure they were 54 or the 12-inch, no, they were 12-inch tall Napoleonic figures that he just had on his mantelpiece. And they just fascinated me. In addition, he used to make model houses inside bottles.
Ooh.
So not model ships, but model houses. Different types of houses, even made outhouses with little toilet paper rolls, which amazed me. And that got me interested in that world, so to speak. The other thing that kind of sparked the interest was for those that are old enough to remember when comic books had the advertisements for battles between like Romans and barbarians, American Civil War. You send I think it was like $3 or something, and you get basically two armies. I believe they were like 172 scale, more or less. And I got American Revolution, so I had a red army and a blue army.
Nice.
And I made my brothers, my two younger brothers, play with me, even though we all had no idea how to play a proper war game. So we just, and from there I kind of floated into it's weird because it's before the internet, so it's I floated into finding a game store, and then I remember buying the old Courier magazine because it had a picture of a siege on the cover, and for some reason I love sieges, medieval sieges, and in there were companies that made figures, and they had the catalog. So I had to send a wasn't a self-addressed stamped envelope, but I just write for a catalog in the old days and get stuff that way. And I remember my first lead miniatures, which was actual lead.
Oh my!
Yeah, don't eat the lead, don't eat the metal lead. And it was 20 millimeter Vietnam, both Viet Cong and U.S. I believe it was U.S. Army. And the only reason I got those was because my dad's a Vietnam vet, and so obviously, from hearing his stories and just being interested in general, I bought those figures. And from there, as the years progressed, I saw a box of, I want to say it was 4th edition fantasy box from Games Workshop, but it was like a sample pack. So it was a box with 60 models in it, and they're all plastic, but they're not the plastic they make now. It was that really hard white plastic that it was like, when I mean hard, I mean it was a solid chunk. There was no customizing that plastic. It was just hard to cut. Yeah. But it was 60 models, but it was 10 models of like 6 different races. So it was like 10 Skaven. You got 10 Skaven. I believe it was 10 orcs, 10 goblins, 10 elves, 10 dwarves, and I believe it was 10 humans. And again, there were stats there, and these were back when they had willpower and cool and leadership, which tells you roughly what edition it was. I believe it was like 3rd or 4th edition. I didn't know what it was, and we had I remember this distinctly. We had a Lego castle set at the house that we had built. So we played with those GW models with the Lego castle set. And again, this I don't know what CL means. Now I know it meant cool. But we just made up what these numbers represented and just played that way with my brother. Again, enlisting my brothers to make them play with me because I needed someone to play with.
Sure.
And I still have a fair amount of those models, still unpainted. So, like most modern gamers.
Yeah, I've got a massive grayscale army too.
Yeah. And then when I went to a store, I saw the box art for the original Space Marine 1st edition Epic. So I bought that, and that's what really got me into Games Workshop games, because the sampler box I didn't know what Games Workshop was. I just saw these models with orcs and goblins, and I had read Tolkien by that point, so of course I'm going to buy it. And so I bought this box. I read about the Horus Heresy, and I was hooked from then on. The Horus Heresy is what hooked me, which is why the current series that they're doing is just blowing my mind. All 100 books or whatever they're at right now. And then from there it went to Rogue Trader, and I also got Adeptus Titanicus, because they're kind of paired together more or less. So I had the Styrofoam buildings and the the Titans, all that good stuff. And then I started reading White Dwarf. That's where I started. I continue to be part of that Games Workshop world, so to speak, because it is a bit set apart from the other aspects of wargaming, historical or otherwise. So I've been playing Games Workshop essentially ever since. Now I help run tournaments for their competitive side, and play in tournaments as well for Frontline Gaming, which is one of the ones that puts out the largest 40K tournament in the world, at the very least, in Vegas every January. So
it's kind of the one that everybody aims for. I know that I've definitely looked at it and been, I could go to LVO. I would get my my butt handed to me, but I could go to LVO.
Well, they do have a friendly event. So, ooh. And the only difference between the two is I believe it's only 4 games, but it's 4 hours each game. So,
Okay.
So if you're not into the competitive side, you can do that. There's a narrative event also. There's Kill Team. There's Blood Bowl. Adeptus Titanicus this year, I believe, as well as some of the historical games like Flames of War, Team Yankee, Bolt Action. More of the big name ones. It's not so much. It's not really it's not really like a convention, but they do have some historical games there, as well as other manufacturers that have games like War Machine, Marvel Crisis Protocol, Conquest by Parabellum, games of that nature. So it's I call it a convention, but they wouldn't.
Well, no, it sounds like there's something for everybody. It's touted as one of the biggest, or like you said, the biggest Warhammer tournament in the world. But there's so much else going on that just about anybody who's a war gamer at all could find something they like there.
Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of other games, and they're always adding games. It's essentially whoever wants to run a game or a tournament or whatever, they'll make room for it usually, as long as they can get people to sign up. So, like I said, there's all the different GW games in addition to all the non-GW games. There's hobby classes for basically the hobby paint classes, really. And it's not just one person. It's a number of different people you may know from Twitch or from GW teaching how to paint your little tiny men.
Well, right on. Yeah, that sounds outstanding. Like I said, I've been meaning to go at some point, but it's definitely higher on my list even before, even more so than before. But you were mentioning also playing Warhammer 40K. Do you have a favorite army that you like to use?
The first army I played or built was Chaos, and it was Black Legion. The idea of more or less like fallen angels, especially someone falling from so high, the higher you go, the farther down the fall type of thing.
Sure.
Just appealed to me, and their I don't want to say redemption, just because of the nature of the fluff or the background, because they are chaos. But just the nature of their rebirth as the Black Legion, casting off their shame of being on the losing side of the Civil War and reimagining themselves as this new Legion. If anyone is interested, if you ever have a chance, you should read the two books by Aaron Dempsey Bowden, which is Talon of Horus and Black Legion. They're really good and really help explore the whole formation of the Black Legion and what they stand for. But even before the books, I was hooked on that. So I play Black Legion mostly. I do have a Thousand Sons army, and I do have a Death Guard army, and I do have a Tzeentch Demons army. So I play a lot of Chaos.
I was going to say, you sound like a Chaos man. You probably enjoying looking at the decor behind me, all these Chaos
Yeah.
soldiers.
I do have someone made a banner. I do have a Horus Heresy banner, which I keep at the local store, a local game shop. So, but yeah, it's funny because every time there's a new army, I'm like, oh, I should try that army, and then I just look at my Chaos. No, just play Chaos.
Right. But it's a lot of work, of course, to build and paint and learn. I know that the Votann just came out, and I am so in love with dwarves. Like, Tolkien's dwarves were some of my favorite part of that, but I'm already so committed. I've already got like 3 armies that I'm really deep into, so I cannot justify taking on another army, even one as cool as Space Dwarves.
Yeah, it's the same way. When I first saw the rules and watched it, and watched some of the previews and stuff, I'm like, oh, they look pretty cool, and then again I'm like, well, I could just play my Chaos because I don't have to paint anything. I have practically all the models, so there's not much I need to buy. I buy stuff just to update the models, although I still have a couple of my old original RBT-01 Space Marines sprinkled in my Chaos army. They're much shorter than the current models, but it's, for me, it's a bit a tie to my original army way back when.
Well, and Abaddon's just so good. It'd be hard to move into any other army after having him on the field and getting to use him.
Yeah, with the current rules for him, and he's in my army. When he gets a chance, he would just march through an army like it's nothing with his current rules.
Well, he can take on some of the other like biggest things in the whole of the game, like demon lord or demon princes and Guilliman and all sorts of stuff. He can hold his own against them, if not do way better.
Yeah, there was a YouTube channel that did just that. They pit him against every other HQ unit, and he got through. He killed like almost all of them. The only one he died to was Mortarion. And that was only because he wasn't at full wounds, because apparently what they did was after every fight he regenerated, I think it was like D3 wounds or something like that. So he wasn't at full strength, but I believe Mortarion was. But even then, he still went through a majority of the characters in the game right now. So
that is crazy. Oh
yeah, so he's living up to the name.
Well, I'm joining you. Not in the Black Legion. I'm playing Word Bearers. That's the army that I'm getting into right now. But no, we'll fight over there as your rivals. I was about to say we could fight side by side, but Chaos doesn't really work like that.
No. It's one of the reasons why. If you read the background, they'll be like close to winning, and then somebody will decide at that moment to basically do something they shouldn't. Or attack their own side, or try to take something that belongs to somebody else, and it causes a lot of confusion and infighting at the moment of victory.
Well, hey, you were just talking about the Horus Heresy, and Lorgar tried to do the whole. I don't want to spoiler alert for anybody who's still reading, but of course Lorgar tries to do the whole usurp thing. He gets cast down. Horus says, "Get out of here," and he takes the majority of his legion with him. The Word Bearers are one of the largest legions in the game. Them and the Ultramarines are up there. Some of the largest legions in the game, especially during the heresy. And so you can't help but wonder how much those bodies would have made a difference at the Siege of Terra.
Right, and there's more of that. If you haven't read the Siege, especially, there's more of that as the Siege continues with guys doing whatever they want or their own thing instead of trying to get the job done.
Sure. So, Emperor's Children, eh?
That's one of them. There's a couple. There's at least one more that I don't want to spoil, but
right.
If you haven't read it yet.
Now, Emperor's Children's kind of anybody who's read has to assume that the children of Fulgrim would be off, kind of enjoying themselves.
Yes, and that's been in the background for almost the beginning, since they started fleshing out the Horus Heresy with since first edition Epic Space Marine. So, but there's other at least one other legion that kind of takes their ball and goes home, so to speak. So
we'll keep that one secret.
Yeah.
Well, apart from playing Warhammer 40K, which I love as well and has given us both hours of enjoyment, I'm sure, you had said that you were coming out with a new Meso-American wargaming kind of experience too, right?
That is correct.
You want to talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the game is called Obsidian Empires, and it's basically warfare in Meso-America, pre-Columbian and Spanish exploration. That's more or less the time period of when it is. You can easily play earlier periods because the weaponry didn't change too much at that time. I'm not sure how far back you can go, but it lends itself to. Because the weapons didn't change too much in that period, it lends itself to going further back in time.
Sure. But, so what kind of gameplay does it kind of go into?
So it range a few things. It is first off, you only need 2 dice. You only need a D12 and a D6, and that's all you need. Even though you do use D12, D6, and D3s on occasion, but you really only need, each player only needs just the D12 and the D6. It is alternating activation, so it's not I go you go like most Games Workshop games. So what it does, it keeps you active during the game. You're probably familiar as if you play a Games Workshop game and some other games, historical games, while your other player is doing their movement, you can literally just walk away and do something and then come back, and then it's your turn to do something. So right. It's not very interactive at certain points, especially early on when things are just moving and not really anything else happening. So with alternating activation, you're always doing something, and then that's in each step. So each movement, shooting, melee, even when units have to take morale, you're alternating which units take the morale check. The other thing about it is that we don't. There's no armor save if you play, and a lot of my references are to Games Workshop because that's what a lot of people play. Similar would be like some Warlord games, not all of them, but where they have like an armor save. So if you're wearing a certain type of armor, there's a certain value you have to hit in order to ignore that wound or that damage. In this game, that step is completely skipped. So what ends up happening instead is, after a successful hit, your opponent rolls to see how much damage he does, and then whatever armor you are wearing, or whatever, in addition to whatever special rolls you may have or army rolls, it mitigates the damage that you receive.
So kind of a DR sort of thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so like, for example, if I was shooting at you and I hit you and I do, let's say, 8 damage, but because I'm wearing, let's say if I'm Spanish and I'm heavily armored, because I'm wearing, a steel breastplate, I have a shield, I have a helmet, that mitigates the 8 damage to maybe like 3 or 4. So the unit only takes, damage after that reduction has been made. And even then, damage is based on the unit, not individual models. You do pull individual models out of the unit, but you distribute damage from a damage pool. So a unit takes 12 damage total, and then you distribute who takes the damage. Now you still have to pull whole models, but and each unit might have a different wound value for that unit. So more common units have less wounds. More elite units have more wounds per model.
Makes sense.
In addition, it is similar to BattleTech. All the damage is done at the end of the turn, or at the end of the step. So everyone does all their shooting, regardless of how much damage the unit takes. They shoot at however many models they have. So if they have a full 10 men, and let's say they lose 9 of them, which would normally reduce their effectiveness, they still shoot as if they were at a full 10-man unit. Once everyone's done shooting, you then resolve the damage, and then that 10-man reduces down to 1 guy. So it keeps you in the game. So if you have a unit, because if you play Games Workshop or some of the other games, because of the I go you go system, when a unit is destroyed and it's not your turn, you don't get to do anything with that unit.
Right. If it's out on first turn, it was just there as a paperweight.
Yeah, it's just as a placeholder or a way for me to get closer to you, basically. And they don't do anything else, that game. And it's something when something like that happens, it can be very disheartening for the player, especially if it's a unit that they're really proud of, or maybe they spent time painting it, or they just think it's a cool unit and they want to just play it on the table and they don't get to do anything because they just got killed right before the game even starts, essentially, for them. So with this system, they at least get to play with their toys, even though they may not be there, after you're done playing with the toy. But so there's that. There's also kind of a common unit mechanic in that, because there are a lot of similarities, especially in the Meso-American armies. They use a lot of the same units, so a lot of the army building is much the same for most of the units. For most of the armies, it's really just the special roles and whatever army choice limitations you have that really define the armies. The last thing about the game, and we can talk a little later about the reasons why I made the game, but what I want to talk about is I incorporated a way to simulate how Meso-American armies fought at that time. One of the big issues, well, I guess I'll talk about it now. One of the big issues I had with gaming that era and that part of the world is that, one, it's shoehorned into. Well, whenever you see a game and it has Aztecs, they place them in the Renaissance era because that's when it happened. 1520 to 1520s and 30s, and because of that, and they more more importantly, they shoehorn them into fighting in a European style. Block troops, squealing and square movement, things of that nature.
Which they very much did not historically.
No, which they did. They fought more almost like Dark Ages combat, where it's not necessarily a shield wall, but it's just a group of guys running at each other. And yeah, they stay in their unit, but once the battle lines hit, they almost broke out into individual combats. Mm-hmm. For a couple of reasons. One was basically almost like show off to the gods, but also to capture their opponents, because one way to improve your station in life, whether you were a commoner or a noble, was to capture opponents, almost like Count Coup in Native North American Native American tribes. So I incorporated a mechanic where all Meso-American armies can, instead of doing what we call a damage pool, which is where you pull out the models after all the fighting's done, mm-hmm. you can instead choose to try capture damage. And what that does is it allows you to capture the model instead of kill the model. And with that, you gain victory points no matter what the scenario is. So regardless of the scenario, you can earn extra victory points by capturing models.
That's really cool.
And so what ends up happening, especially in our test games, was that if your army had a lot of missile troops, you would soften up some of the more elite troops, because once they take damage, if they had any damage left over, it stays with the unit. And in order to capture a unit, you have to do as much capture damage as that unit has wounds left per model. So if the unit has 5 wounds per model, and there's 3 wounds, they're carrying 3 wounds, so one model technically only has 2 wounds left. All you need to do is 2 capture damage, and you capture that elite unit or that elite model.
Nice. I can't think of any other game that has that kind of mechanic in it. That's really quite unique.
Yeah, and that's the reason I did the game, because that's one of the unique things with the fighting. The only comparable thing I can think of would be medieval combat, where you would want to capture a noble as opposed to killing the noble for the ransom, not necessarily to make the sun rise the next morning.
Right.
So it's similar in nature to that, in that you don't always want to kill your opponent, but you want to capture them to bring them back, so that you can sacrifice them either in ritual combat or as a sacrifice on the altar, in order to basically in their worldview, to sustain the world or make sure the sun rises the next day.
Sure. Because the Aztecs had a very similar idea about the universe as the ancient Indians did, like the Indians, and because the early concept of karma wasn't this interplay between, good things bring you good things, bad things give you bad things. No, it was a concept of sacrifices make the sun rise, and if you're not making them, that sun doesn't come up.
Yeah, and even then, a lot of times, the people being sacrificed, even then thought it was a great honor. So it wasn't like you see in a lot of B movies where you see them people dragging people to be sacrificed and they're kicking and screaming. A lot of times it would, even though they may not want to, but they were captured fair and square and willing sacrifices, and they were given a high place of honor in many times, depending on the festival and things of that nature. But yeah, so I never saw anything like that on the tabletop. Like I said, it was always like square blocks. They're fighting like Europeans, which is not what happened.
Right.
Now, on the flip side, that is probably one of the reasons why they didn't do so well against the Spanish, because the Spanish weren't there to capture people. So
right. Well, they were there to capture something, but it wasn't people.
They weren't really playing the same game or by the same rules. But I felt, and there's other aspects of the game that I put in that I felt captured the flavor of the Mesoamerican armies as a whole, and sometimes as the individual armies or city-states for that particular one. Aztecs had more, for example, a larger population to pull from for their armies, So they get a free novice unit, But I mean, novices are okay, but it's still more bodies they can have, The Purepecha, who is the empire to the west of the Aztecs and one of the few empires that actually resisted the Aztecs for a number of years, they were, from the research I did, they were known to have sturdier bows and be an expert marksmen, to the point where their elite units were said to shoot a hail of arrows on their own. So they have a special rule with doing extra damage with their archers. But also because, and this includes the army construction, because they relied on archers more than Aztecs, they have to have so many archers, or at least more archers than melee units. While Aztecs, on the flip side, have more melee units than archers, because Aztecs relied more on the close combat aspect of their armies as opposed to the missile troops. And it's the same with the other armies around. And I focused this more on the central Mexico, which is why you only see, because what I noticed also is that most games only focused on what I call the big three, which is Aztec, Mayans, and Incas. Mm-hmm. They didn't talk about anybody else, especially some of the other empires that were maybe not as big, but just as important, or in the region. So Mayans aren't in this one, or Incas, but I hope to add them soon.
So again, this is absolutely fascinating to me, because most war games are set, if not in Europe and that style of war, at least within its spirit. So like a lot of 40K, I would say, is very much a European style of war. But what kind of factions do you have? Obviously, we have the Spanish and we have the Aztec, but what kind of other factions are we looking at?
So the first faction, like I mentioned earlier, was Purepecha, but most people know them as, not most. A lot of older players know them as Tarasco or Tarascan, but the current term is Purepecha, because that's what they call themselves, or that's what the commoners call themselves, because most of the nobles were killed, so they don't know the actual name of the region. And this is west of the empire, west of Mexico. I mean, west of the Aztecs and modern day Michoacan.
Okay.
So and they still speak the same language. That's where my family is from. There, and Durango, which is more north of, and Chichimec, that's more north of Mexico City. But most of my father's side is from Michoacan. My mother's side is from Durango, like I said. But that's so they still speak the language. Known for their metalcraft, one of the few areas. The language is much different than the native Aztec language, so there's some question about where they're from. But again, they were the second largest empire in the region at that time, the time of the conquest, and they had, and about a year or two before Cortez had shown up, they had defeated the Aztecs in a large battle at that time, and one of the reasons why the Aztecs fell to the Spanish was obviously the help that the Spanish got, but also when they went to the Purepecha for help, there was so much distrust that they didn't want to help, because they didn't trust the Aztecs with what they were telling them, what was happening. But they did sing a different tune when they saw what happened to the Aztecs.
Sure. And I mean, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that there was more than enough militant power within Meso-America to successfully resist the Spanish if it had been united.
Oh, yeah. And if everyone didn't probably, I'm not going to say everyone, but if a majority of the area did not harbor some, hatred might be a strong word, but some
resentment.
Resentment, yeah, that's what I'm looking for. Resentment against the Aztec and Triple Alliance. That's the faction on the west. The other faction is Tlaxcala, which is if you ever look on any map of the Aztec Empire, there's this one little hole in the middle of the empire, and that's the Tlaxcala. And they were in the process of being conquered when the Spanish arrived, and they were the ones that allied with the Spanish to war against the Aztecs, and they were in the process of being absorbed by the Aztecs. It probably would have happened eventually, but with the arrival of the Spanish, the Tlaxcalans had an ally they can use against the Aztecs. And they're actually the only listed ally for the Spanish, because the Spanish, you can't have an army full of with nothing but Spanish units. You have to have a contingent of native units, and that's basically you pull from the Tlaxcala list.
But that makes sense.
Yeah, and even then, it's X amount of points for Spanish. The rest have to be Tlaxcalan troops. And that's the third, and they had a similar military society as Aztecs. So a lot of the units are interchangeable. It's really the special rules and the army limitations that really set them apart. Purepecha, like I mentioned before, they were different in that they did not follow, as far as I could tell from the research I did, they did not follow the same societal structure that the Aztecs and most other Mesoamerican armies did in that area. They had one special unit called Valiant Ones, which were their nobles and veteran troops, and then everything else was just all commoners and novices. But like I said before, they took a lot of missile troops, and the often quoted description of their bows were that in the findings I had was that their construction of their bows were so sturdy they used them. You can use them as clubs, and they just wouldn't break. That's how sturdy the bows were. In that they were expert marksmen along those lines. But
I want that bow.
But I know, right? But so the Tlaxcalans are the third, and then the fourth one are the Huastec, which is a city-state closer to the modern area of Veracruz. So near the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, and at the time of the Spanish conquest, they were slowly being just like the Tlaxcalans. Their empire or their territory was slowly being absorbed by the Aztecs. They had lost a lot of their southern territories to the Aztecs leading up to the Spanish arrival. And the thing about them is they are actually of Mayan descent. That had migrated. I can't remember the actual time period, but it was early Mayan history where they migrated from the Yucatan Peninsula to the area of Veracruz and the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. And again, but they still followed the military society structure that the Aztecs and Tlaxcalans used. So, and again, their slight difference was that they used spears a little more. But there's other special rules for them that allow them to differentiate them from the other armies.
Well, this is just so cool.
And there's only 5. I originally actually had 9 armies, but
wow.
But I was like, this is a lot, and during playtest, it was hard to balance all of them.
I'm sure they're going to be expansions. If this catches on, you can
if
still
it catches
add
on.
More in. Yeah.
Even if it doesn't, I may add at the very least the other 2 of the big 3, the Mayan and Incas, either on the publisher's website or my own. Once I get that going, and so it will be something available to people eventually, whether it's in a book or on a website or in some form. I'm pretty sure I'll have something for at the very least for the Mayans and the Incas. I do have at least 4 other armies because my idea is to go south. So then the next book, so to speak, or the next section would be the Yucatan Peninsula and southern Mexico / northern Central America, which includes the Mayans, Zapotec, Mixtec. And there is one more that I can't remember off the top of my head, but yeah. So they're already they're on paper. I just need to flesh them out and align them with the current rule set, and they should be good to go.
Well, this is just fascinating. In absolutely no joking terms, I want to know when this comes out because I want to play this game. As a historian, again, being largely educated in Eurocentral tradition, don't know nearly as much as I would like to about the Mesoamerican tribes or about Mesoamerican history. For a neophyte like myself to this sort of thing, what was your source material? Where can I go to learn more about this?
So it's okay. So there's not a lot in compared to Europe most other parts of the world, only because of the results of the Spanish conquest and burning of a lot of the books and things of that nature.
Sure.
One of the big ones I did was I found was a book on 16th century armies by, I believe it's Ian Heath, and he's done a number of those books. I think but that one is actually hard to come. It's not hard to come by. It's just expensive. Last time I checked, I happened to get a copy. But the last time I checked, I think on eBay, when I looked, it was like going for like $200. Amazon, I think Amazon might have one for a bit cheaper. That one's a really good source, because he has illustrations, and it's funny because there's a few of the manufacturers base their models off of those illustrations. A couple of those illustrations, and he's a big one. The other one was there's one called Aztec Warfare. Let me see, and there's I forget the author on that one. Usually I with a lot of the books I have are actually for the southern areas like Zapotec, Mixtec. Osprey has a number of books out. Whether it's they have one for the Siege of Tenochtitlan. They have their Warrior Elite series, which includes the Aztec Warrior. They have one again that covers Mixtec, Zapotec, Mixtec armies, the campaign system for Meso-American armies or Osprey. That's actually where I got a lot of the books, and they have if you go to their bibliography, there's a lot of sources there. But I went to. I really just went with to be honest, I went with whatever the bibliography was in the Osprey books from there. But the Ian Heath one is probably the major one if you're looking for a more complete, because he includes all Native Americans from the Caribbean, I believe southern U.S., Mexico, Central America, and I believe South America, as well as the Spanish at that time.
Wow. I have learned so much today.
Yeah, so and that's one of the reasons why I decided to do it was, to be honest, was a game that came out in a number of years ago, and it was before the pandemic, and they just had the big three, and I was not upset, but it's one of those things, like I mentioned, because my family's from Mexico, so it's like in the DNA, and I can almost safely claim I'm not Aztec, like everyone mostly assumes most Mexican Americans are, which is funny because my wife technically is, because she's from Mexico City, but and it was one of those things where we talk about, or society talks about wanting to be represented. You know, you want to see yourself, and luckily for me, I live in Southern California, so in wargaming, you know, there's other people of Mexican or of descent, especially in, you know, like I said, I live in Southern California, so I see other people that look like me playing war games, like my uncle. Whether historical or 40K, but I know that there's other areas of the country and the world where it's not so much, and so which we talked about, which we mentioned was the Eurocentric focus of war games in general, and why I mentioned of the shoehorning the Aztecs into fighting like a European fights. And I felt, like I mentioned, that yeah, it's nice, Aztecs, you know, Incas, Mayas, but that's not who I am, and I wanted to see. It's almost like I always equate the Meso-America region, both North and South America, to like Greek city-states. Yeah, we talk like ancient Greek city-states. Yeah, we talk about Greece. We talk, Greece united, blah blah blah. But they weren't really. Greece wasn't a country. We just call it that, ancient Greece, when it's really, you know, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, all these different city-states that happened to band together to fight the Persians, or fight each other, depending on, when you're talking. And that's how I see that Meso-American world in that same light. So when you don't make games and just talk about certain aspects. When I see other games, they talk about almost every aspect of, the ancient Greece. They talk about all, practically all the city states, not just like 2 or 3. And that's one of the reasons I felt bringing to light some of the other, like Tlaxcalan, like the allies of the Spanish, or Purepecha, the second. No one talks about the second largest because they were the second.
Right.
And history probably would have seen them different if they had landed on the west coast as opposed to the east coast. So, and to be honest, the Purepecha didn't fight back because they saw what happened to the Aztec, and they're just like, "Nah, we're good. You can go ahead and take over." So,
and like you were saying with Greece, because again we have this Eurocentric education, Eurocentric focus for wargaming, all these tiny details. Like most people, if you mentioned Athens, they know Athens. If you mentioned Sparta, they absolutely would know Sparta.
Oh, yeah.
But there were several city-states or empires that you mentioned that many of our listeners have probably never heard of. They probably just assumed the whole area was Aztec and left it at that.
Yeah, and it's part of being the biggest and the first, being conquered in that way, especially since many of the especially because the second largest, city state did just gave up. They basically just gave up after what they saw what happened to the Aztecs. There were still pockets, here and there, just like with any, just like with what happens when someone is conquered. There's always those pockets of resistance, but for the most part, yeah, after seeing what happened to the Aztecs, it kind of like, okay, well, we don't want that to happen to us, but yeah, so I made the game. Like I mentioned, I started with 8 armies. I originally wasn't going to have the Spanish in there, but then after going through most of it, I was like, well, you kind of have to have the Spanish involved. It's kind of you can't have one without the other. So, and then I did cut it down. And I cut it down along those geographic lines because in my mind, if I wanted to expand, I could just go south and then include Mayans and some of the other city states or tribes in that area. And there's the option of, like I said, just to put Incas in that because I can go further south and just include all of South America in one more book if need be, or if I put something on a website to just to give people to start their Incan and Mayan armies, and also, like I said, it was something that I felt needed to better represent how they fought, so that people just don't assume they fought, even though people know they fought they didn't fight in blocks. Just to see it on the tabletop or see it as a possible, like with the capture mechanic, reaction. I felt needed to be shown because that especially the capturing of opponents was just something you never saw, like you mentioned, in any other game that involved Aztecs, because Aztecs are just shoehorned in with every other European army in a Renaissance era rulebook.
Well, even though, like you were saying, like a huge part of their warfaring culture was around this capturing of opponents either for slavery or sacrifice. So not including that is just sort of omitting part of their reason for being there in the first place.
Right. And whatever happening, the other thing, and the reason why I mentioned it, there's only 2. You only use 2 dice, was because like we've discussed, Games Workshop games and some historical games is what I call a bucket of dice game. And for those that don't know what that means, that's literally you roll a bucket of dice, or seems like it, when you play the game, especially in 40K when you play orcs.
Or Imperial Guard or something like that.
Admech.
Yeah.
So you're rolling like 30, 40 dice sometimes, and I was like, I just want to roll 2 or 1. Because the game plays, once you get the hang of it, the game plays fairly quick. There's no charts or like formulations to look at. You don't have to compare your strength to their toughness. You don't have to, You don't have to worry about range because there's no range is unlimited in the game because of the distances it represents, because it's playing on a 4x4, and you only have between 30 to 50 models depending how you build your army. So so range is unlimited. You don't have to worry about range. You don't have to worry about, like I said, the armor save. You just have to wear armor. And you're only going to roll like 1 or 2 dice, with 3 at most. But with that mechanic, and the armor mechanic and everything happening at the end, so you don't have to decide, which guy am I going to pull? I don't know. You just pull guys at the end once all the damage is there, and then sometimes your choice is made for you because your whole unit's wiped out. But they got to do what they wanted to do, and the game, when we got it to about 90 minutes, especially just playing, not including setup, because it just depends how you want to set up your game. Sure. But it should play about 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours at most. And it's all modifiers. It's all pluses and minuses. There's special rules, but there's no charts or in-depth charts you need. It's very simple, and the information is very surface level. So what we've talked about today is kind of in depth, but in the information I've given, I give a general information, a brief history of the area, and then a brief description of the units, just to give you a little taste of what it is. I don't go into the fact that as a novice, there's like 3 levels of novice depending on how many people you captured. And then you can branch that off. There's then the priest level they're the priests that have their own levels, of how many people they captured. And then once you get into the knightly orders with the Jaguar or Eagle Knights, there's another whole multiple layers, and it all depends how many guys you captured. So I didn't take that deep dive because I know that would probably I didn't want it to be too much. So I just gave people a taste of, here's what they were like, and it's almost like the Starship Troopers. Would you like to know more? And nowadays there's plenty of places you can go to on the internet, to find out more about them, especially YouTube. YouTube's really good of finding out what life was like for the common Aztec person in general, not necessarily military, but also just the commoner, what the daily life was like for someone living at that time. And it was actually pretty comparable to a lot of modern cities during the Renaissance.
Sure. Well, Adam, we have gone over massively for this section, and we didn't get to the defense relations at all, and yet I could keep talking with you on this subject for another hour at least. This is absolutely fascinating to me, and I did not want to stop you. I still don't want to stop you, but my editor will literally put me on a spike if I don't.
That's all right.
But Adam, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been fantastic.
Oh, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks.
And check out what is this game called when it comes out?
So the game is called Obsidian Empires. You can find it at Military Miniatures Press is the publisher. You can go to Military Miniature singular militaryminiaturepress.com, and you can pre-order right now. It comes out December 1st, and you can either get an electronic version or a physical copy. So.
Well, outstanding. And again, this is Adam of TFG Radio. If you are even trying at being a competitive 40K player and you aren't listening to this, you should be.
If you want to know what's going on in competitive, we do talk about tournaments and things like that mainly. And especially also if you plan to go to LVO, we talk a lot about LVO, especially after this weekend. We'll start gearing up for LVO. So.
Well, perfect. And thanks again, Adam, for coming on. And for the rest of us, I believe that will conclude it. That's our show. Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't had enough of the art of wargaming in your life, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram, where I occasionally post funny and educational memes. If you want to get in touch with the show directly, you can email us at artofwargamingpodcast@gmail.com with any questions, comments, or concerns that you might have. Also be sure to check out all of our sister shows on the Earworm Network, including General Nerdery, Word Balloons, Fried Squirms, and more. We're working hard on having something for everyone. And again, you can find those at earworm.com. That's EARVVYRM. You can also find that in the show notes. But for now, this has been Yaga Malark, signing off.